All right, so tonight, for the first half, we're going to try to do the Cold War in about an hour, which is insane and ridiculous, which follows the normalcy of almost every other topic we've tried to cover in an hour in this whole semester. In my modern American history classes, I usually take about 4 or 5 hours to do the Cold War, so I'm trying to boil down all that stuff into something much faster. So we will go fast, and I can't recall how much writing there is in these slides. But the general thing I want to talk about in this is the idea of the Cold War, especially from the American side, and then present the Soviet side, what they viewed as the Cold War, and a lot of the hypocrisies that we see emerging in the Cold War. And if you study this thing objectively, you don't get very much involved in like the emotions of supporting either side. Hypocrisies present themselves very, very quickly, and hypocrisies that still, many argue, tend to dominate U.S. foreign policy right to this very moment. The beginnings of the Cold War have their roots in the end of World War II, and anyone who's taken a high school history class or watched any documentary or read any textbook should understand that, or should have been taught that. The Western or the Allied military policy to conquer Germany and end World War II in Europe was basically the Americans, the British, the Canadians, and the French all attacked Germany from the west and push eastward into Germany, and the Soviets attacked from the east and they pushed westward into Germany. And this is what General Eisenhower called basically the giant pinching movement, where you have massive resources, massive armies just attacking Germany from both sides. And it's eventually successful at very great human and economic costs. The problem with that is that you got a divided Europe. To go back to the map real fast. The Soviets got to Berlin first. So the Soviets conquered not just Eastern Germany, but all the way down to the other areas that the Germans had conquered. So the Soviet army has conquered and is continually occupying those areas in the post-war period. The Western Allies, led, of course, by the United States, has conquered or reconquered France and is occupying a lot of those areas, and will reconquer basically Western Germany right up to about the Elbe River, getting closer to Berlin, but not quite there all the way. And they occupy those places for, they say, stability, and they start to, throughout the war, they hold a series of high-level meetings. The very last of them is at Yalta in February of 1945, the last 2 months or so of the actual fighting. And at Yalta, the leaders of the so-called Big Three in the alliance, Churchill from Britain, President Roosevelt from the U.S., and Stalin from the Soviet Union, agree. They decide on 3 major policies for the post-war period. Number 1, they will divide Germany amongst themselves. They will occupy Germany for at least a few years to rebuild it and to ensure that no German nationalist politicians could rise and make another attempt at power the way Hitler had in the 1920s and 30s. So they will keep their armies in Germany. They will divide Germany into eventually 4 sections to include France also in the occupation. So each of these powers plus France will get a German zone, what they call the occupational zones. They also agreed to create what was then called the United Nations Organization, which today has just been shortened to United Nations, as basically a new system of what was kind of like the League of Nations, but slightly different. Again, building up an international courtroom type of atmosphere so that instead of going to war against each other when countries had a dispute, they would take their complaints to a Security Council at the UN. And the UN is eventually giving an army to enforce its decisions, what they call peacekeeping forces, even today. And these 3 countries, plus 2 more, France and China, are given veto powers at the UN Security Council. And they're given permanent seats on the council. So the council is made into a 15-member body. 5 of them are permanent members that have veto power. So you can have a vote of 14 to 1. If that one has the veto power, then resolutions are killed. And that's the way it still stands today. And that's why you get a lot of historians and international commentators saying that the UN Security Council is basically has frozen international politics at 1945. And that should be reformed. So that's something you read about pretty commonly. Another thing that they agreed on, and that was mostly a U.S. demand at Yalta, was especially for the Soviets to join the war against Japan. The Soviets had launched their massive amount, the overwhelming amount of their military offensive against Germany. The United States, though, is still fighting Japan at the end when Germany surrenders, and will fight Japan for another 4 months or so. So the Americans were very concerned to make sure that the Soviets would send their armies eastward to take on Japan, because the Americans didn't want to do it alone, and were still unsure about the atomic bomb being ready. Remember, the atomic bomb isn't completed until July. So 5 months after this. So the Soviets agree to help, but eventually the Soviet kind of mobilization eastward is so slow that the Americans develop the bomb and use it to end the war before the Soviets really get involved. So questions about any of these things? Pretty clear cut. You guys have heard of Yalta before, I hope? No? Okay. All right. Also at Yalta and in other several high-level meetings, you have a conflict between the Western leaders and the Eastern leaders, notably Stalin and the Soviets. Stalin and the Soviet leadership is absolutely, completely paranoid of the Germans being able to get back together and maybe in a few years, maybe a few decades, launch another invasion eastward. Remember, the Soviet Union took the overwhelming brunt of the German invasion. The German invasion that attacked the Soviets in 1941 is still today the largest military offensive in history. So the Soviet populations and the Soviet government had suffered very, very great losses that just dwarfed what the Americans suffered in these fighting. So Stalin and the Soviets demand that the Eastern European states that are being rebuilt in the wake of the war, as these so-called Big Three and others kind of sit down and redraw the borders of the European countries, the Soviets demand that these Eastern European countries that are being rebuilt will be large and strong enough to resist a German attack, and that they be, quote, pro-Soviet in their foreign policy. Because the Soviets want what they call a buffer zone between Germany and themselves. So if the Germans ever get back together somehow and attack eastward, they'll first have to go through these powerful countries, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and that they would basically be bogged down because the Soviets demand that those Eastern European countries would help the Soviets in repelling a future German invasion. And Stalin just doesn't demand that they eventually are kind of pro-Soviet in their foreign policies, but they're also communist economies. And Stalin can make that demand because the Soviet army is still encamped in those places. And when he makes these demands, the Western leaders look at each other and basically calculate that it would take World War III to force the Soviet army out of Eastern Europe. And that was something they were very unwilling to start in the weeks after World War II had just ended. Churchill and Roosevelt, largely, especially at Yalta, make the demand that eventually these areas in Eastern Europe are given the ability to have their own elections so they can vote in their own leaders, and then they can determine how they want to run their own economies without Soviet interference. But that demand is basically given up on in the long term. So the Soviet army basically will choose the Eastern European leaders for decades. And they will create Soviet-style dictatorships, basically Stalinist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. And their economies will be communist, and they will be pro-Soviet in their foreign policy. And eventually they'll create a military alliance to defend their holdings, all under the very watchful eye and under Red Army guns. Anyone who complains what's going on in Eastern Europe for decades disappears, just like people did in the Soviet Union under Stalin himself. So Stalin doesn't live many years after he dies in 1953, but the systems that he set up perpetuated themselves for decades. And many historians argue once you see those governments or those idea is that the Red Army will destroy any internal complaint. Once that idea goes away, those governments fall within a matter of months, even in some cases a matter of weeks in 1989. But those are the systems that will be around for a long, long, long time. Churchill and Roosevelt demanded that other areas that had been kind of reconquered, so-called liberated from the Germans in World War II, are given free elections. France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, on and on and on. So Churchill and Roosevelt say that they are fighting or trying to defend democracy in Europe, and they're trying to spread the ability of people to vote for their leadership and have a fairly free society. Of course, their demand also was that those areas would stick with capitalism. But that's the root of the problem, that Europe is basically territorially and militarily divided between a Soviet-style East and a Western-style capitalist West. Questions about that at all? This is all pretty basic. You've heard this before, I hope. Okay. Can you think of any places that were reconquered in World War II that were not open to elections, free elections, that especially the Westerners took control of? Nope. Japan. The United States conquered Japan. Americans wrote the Japanese Constitution for the most part, and Japan lived under an American military occupation for many years. And even to this day, Japan is only allowed to have a defensive army. They're not allowed to have atomic weapons. So the United States played a very, very heavy hand in Japan for several decades. And that's one good example of, Churchill and Roosevelt and the Westerners saying we are pro-democracy, until you kind of cast a wider look, and until you look into the history of Italian elections, where the CIA very quickly went in to guarantee that pro-American factions in Italy won those elections. That's one of the first uses of the CIA in what we call kind of black operations or secret operations. Okay. And one thing that I think is very important in understanding the Cold War, especially in this American society, this Americanized culture, that tends to believe that the United States fought the good side, or the pure side, or the side of goodness and right in the Cold War. We are absolutely saturated with the idea that the United States always acts internationally in the best interest of democracy and freedom and liberty and whatnot. One thing that's very important to understand about the Cold War is that the Soviets believed the same thing. And that the Soviets defined the United States as a source of evil in the world also. So they believe similar things about themselves, and they believe similar things about the Cold War adversary. To give some examples, both sides thought of themselves as the upholders of human dignity and freedom. The United States sees itself as the upholder of freedom and equality through voting rights, through democracy. But the Soviets talk about, what do you think the Soviets talked about as the basis of equality in their society? They don't obviously have much democracy going on. Where does their equality come from? Or so they say. Yeah.
The first unite idea that they're all equal.
Yeah, that there is no rich and there are no poor. Since the government runs the factories, everyone gets paid the same no matter what kind of position you have. Therefore, there are not the greedy capitalists out there that, through Marxist ideology, says, start these major wars and these colonizations. That was Marxist criticism. That inequality is actually created by capitalism. And that the greedy rich look for more and more for themselves, so they go to war and they conquer foreign places. So both sides saw themselves as the upholders of human freedom, individuality, dignity in their own societies. Both sides also claim to be the leader of future human freedom, and the United States has a long history of that, going all the way back to colonization, with Winthrop's statements on the city upon a hill, that people will look to America as the example of a morally perfect society. Winthrop was a Puritan, believed that he was basically creating God's perfect society on earth, and that once that society succeeded beyond all others, that they would be the example to the world. That's why he called it City Upon a Hill, that everyone would look up and see the United States as the greatest place ever, or America, what eventually becomes the United States, as the greatest place ever, and that they would try to emulate the United States politically, socially, culturally. And the U.S. has really kept that kind of theory ever since. And it's something you see today's politicians constantly talking about. The United States is the leader in liberty and freedom and democracy, and on and on and on. And of course today it's been combined with capitalism, the freedom to go out and buy whatever you want, and that's what creates prosperity. But the Soviets also said the same thing about themselves, just as Marx said. You'll have to get communism in one country first, and it would spread like wildfire to the rest of the countries of the world, because the rest of the populations would look at their own situation with capitalism, where most people are basically impoverished, and then they would look at the communist society, where everyone is much more equal, and they would try to emulate it through revolution. Both sides also described their adversary as inherently autocratic, anti-democracy, dictatorship-oriented. The United States obviously defines the Stalinist system as obviously repressive, politically destroyed anyone who complained, and the United States is responsible for launching wars of conquest throughout the world. And the Soviets did the same thing to the U.S. Can you think of any inequalities that existed in the U.S. in the 1940s that the Soviets would highlight as an example?
Segregation.
Yeah. Racism. Rampant racism. Violent racism that had killed untold millions of people. The United States is a country that was built on slavery. The American founders who talked about liberty and freedom were all slaveholders, basically. So the Soviet leaders pointed that one out over and over and over again for many, many years as a hypocrisy in the United States. And said that, well, look, you have these major repressed minorities throughout the United States, so how much freedom do they really have? Yeah.
What about the repression or the way they kept their people on their side of the wall by force, basically?
Well, that's one thing that, governments point those kind of things out about their enemies, right? But they never point that criticism about themselves, or usually, right? You may get a few like congressmen or something who talk about it, and then they're quietly hushed up or kicked out of office or something. But governments almost always declare that against their enemies because they want to topple their enemies. They want to win. And you see that going on right now. The United States talking about Syria is an example of all horrible government slaughter of people and whatnot. The United States had a long history of slavery, and this stuff continues. And if you go to Europe and you talk to Europeans about what they see as American culture, they would view it as hugely repressed. Women's equality, gay rights, a whole slew of things where we have a lot of cultural repression.
When I was stationed in Germany in the early 70s, when they had to divide the wall,
Yeah.
and it was clearly obvious the oppression on that side.
Yeah.
I mean, the wall, they had open areas just razor wire and machine guns.
And people getting killed.
And
They just didn't have a wall. When people tried to climb that, they never shot to death on site.
Yeah, and you can look on the other side of the wall and see a gray and black and white society. I mean, that's the way it looked. It looked like an old World War II big poster.
But that's what you get with dictatorships.
Side,
Yeah.
it was colorful, and people are walking around.
Yeah. It's two different interpretations, though, of inequality and oppression. I argue that our so-called free market system is a system of oppression in a lot of ways. And if you want to buy a car, you have limited options. There's a lot of different companies, but they're basically selling almost the same exact thing, right? They're gasoline engines, which are by now outdated technology, by 100 years almost. And as one of my relatives pointed out, have you heard this whole New York City soda sales thing where they limit the cup size you can get? And one of my relatives said, "Oh, I'm sitting here in another state with my 86-ounce whatever she was drinking and saying, I'm proud to be a free American because I get to drink this much soda." That's your definition of freedom? But people in our society are convinced that they're free because they can do things where maybe if you speak out politically about certain things, you get killed, right? So some of us have a slightly different definition of freedom than others, I guess. But you get these different kinds of governments accusing each other because they have enemies and they want to take out their enemies. Whereas when they have international friends or in their own society, they don't want to point that stuff out because that stuff is destabilizing, right? And you're seeing it right now over the Middle East and North Africa. You can just pick out country by country. You can tell just by U.S. statements who is a U.S. ally and who isn't. They look to kill their enemies and protect their allies, even though they have very similar things going on in those societies. Like U.S. doesn't talk about repression in Saudi Arabia. And Barack Obama he almost never says a word Saudi Arabia, right? If you read his speeches. Yeah. So. But it's a certain amount of propaganda. Let's see, where did I leave off? Yep. Both sides focus on the other as like the source of evil and oppression in the world and describe the enemy as trying to topple them. The Soviets declared that the U.S. was sending spies into their country to try to destroy their government. The United States did the exact same thing. If you ever read the history of the late 40s and early 50s, the government started basically a witch hunt of its own employees to try to root out if there are any communist spies working in any sensitive areas or anything like that. So even right up to the U.S. Army. And there's quiet accusations about even General Eisenhower, who became president in 1952. Right? So, but when you look at the Cold War and you understand that both sides are looking at themselves and at each other in very similar light, it's much easier to understand how confrontational it became very quickly. So other questions about this? Okay. You also get a series of so-called declarations of Cold War, which are kind of political statements, but they never actually go to war with each other. That's the interesting thing about the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States never actually fight each other, because that became dangerous very quickly. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the nuclear weapons aspect. Okay. The Soviets don't say it openly, but in the way they were moving to consolidate power and challenge the Westerners and other parts of the world, the Westerners started to come to the realization within a couple years after the end of the war that there is a problem with their former Soviet allies from the war. And one of the biggest statements is the so-called Truman Doctrine, when President Roosevelt died in, I think it's April of '45. So his vice president ascended. And Truman went into the presidency after basically being kept in the dark. As vice president, he didn't even know anything about the atomic bomb being made. He had that dropped on him when he became president. So Roosevelt kept him in the dark on that. So Truman comes in as almost a naive politician. And he has to deal with the growing animosity and international conflict with the Soviets. He and his high leadership seem to finally come to the realization that you cannot deal with the Soviets anymore, that the Soviets, led by Stalin, deal in power relations. They take control where they can, and they keep control for as long as they can. That is the Stalinist system. And you cannot make deals with those kinds of people. That's basically the idea that the Truman leadership comes to in about early going into mid-47. And one of the big examples of this was a civil war in Greece that broke out in the wake of World War II that basically boiled down to a communist faction and an anti-communist faction that was supported by the West. And it looked like the communists in Greece were going to win for a while. And this is where Truman gives his big statement. He says that the United States should financially support anti-communist movements anywhere in Europe, and later he will spread that idea to anywhere, period, anywhere in the whole world. and he used the Greek Civil War. This is a speech to Congress where he is basically asking for money to fund the Greek anti-communists in their conflict, in their civil war. And Truman gives the justification for this, saying that if the communists win in one little place in the world, then communism will spread like a disease to neighboring countries, and then more and more and more until you get basically all, or nearly all, important areas of the world under communist control. And this is what he called the domino theory. That when one important country falls, its neighbors fall, then it spreads to other neighbors and on and on and on, and it's hard to contain. Which is a fairly paranoid outlook on some of this stuff, but that's the argument they give. Yeah.
What was the Truman Doctrine? I didn't get that for some reason.
That's it. He talks about the domino theory and his demand that the U.S. financially, at first, support any anti-communist movement anywhere.
Oh.
And it is a very controversial thing because the United States was an isolationist country for almost its entire history. Now, at the end of World War II, they're making a claim that they're going to intervene in almost any country in the world to ensure the survival of governments that they support. And that's a big, big change. And it's one that has been in place. That ideology has been in place ever since. So we've grown up with it. So we see it as normal. But to the Americans back then, this was a major policy change, and almost everyone recognized it as that. The next couple months later, they do so economically throughout the rest of Europe. The Secretary of State is named George Marshall at the time. He was another head general of World War II. And they come up, the Truman leadership in its highest circles comes up with an idea called the Marshall Plan, which is the idea of offering financial assistance in rebuilding the European economy. Remember, Europe had basically been flattened. Not just Germany and not just Berlin, but almost all European cities have been annihilated. Therefore, the major industries had all been destroyed in World War II. And years later, they're still trying to rebuild. And the theory behind the Marshall Plan is where you have all this destruction, if all the factories have been destroyed, then there's not that many companies that are hiring people. Therefore, there's high unemployment. And these leaders look back to the history of the 1920s and 30s and saw when you have high unemployment, you get radical nationalist politicians that tend to rise and promise radical economic solutions. And they largely identified that with the rise of Hitler. So the theory behind the Marshall Plan is if you allow Europe to slowly grow back into prosperity, if they do it all, if you just allow them to live in the rubble for a while, you will get communists rising up in France, in Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands, on and on and on. All these places have been annihilated. And just to their economic arguments, if you hold free elections, they'll get elected. Therefore, communism might take over the rest of Europe just by voting. So the theory is, if the United States sends a bunch of money over to Europe, and they use that money to rebuild quicker, then you'll get more prosperity, more confidence in anti-communist leaders. And so they will be re-elected, and the United States won't have to fear the spread of communism to Western Europe by voting, or probably by military invasion, because people will want to support their government as is. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Where does the money come from?
It comes from the U.S. Treasury, U.S. taxpayers.
I mean, we just went through a depression, and then we went through World War II. So how did?
Oh yes, but the United States in late '46 starts one of the biggest economic boom periods in all of human history.
So in 2 years they had enough money there to send over there.
Yes,
Wow.
and the U.S. national debt at the end of World War II was even larger than it is today compared to the size of its economy. And they start paying it down fast because their tax rates were high on the rich. We're talking 70 to 90% on the highest incomes. And the rich people were making a lot of money because American factories were the only ones left in the world after World War II. If you want to buy something made in a factory almost anywhere in the world, you're buying it from the United States. So the U.S. market share grew exponentially in the war. It's estimated that at the end of World War II, the United States contained 50% of all the wealth on the planet. Americans own 50% of the wealth of the whole world because so much had been destroyed. And their international plan is to keep that wealth, to not let it seep away. That has obviously failed. Does anyone know what it is today? Percent American dominance of percentage of wealth in the world? Anyone want to take a guess? The United States has about 5% of the world's population, put it that way. Anyone want to take a guess at the amount of wealth, though? No numbers even pop into your head? You guys can count to 100, right? Huh? Nope. 25. Still. Americans own $1 in 4, say, for the whole world, even today. It's been cut in half since World War II, right? 50% to 25%. And a lot of Americans are very angry at that fall from power. But yes, this money came from the U.S. taxpayers. So they're paying down their own debt and they're financing the rebuilding of Europe. And the interesting thing about the Marshall Plan that not a lot of people know about, question? No. Is that they offered it to Eastern Europe too. And this was the real policy plan of the Marshall Plan. The guy who came up with it, named George Kennan, did not just want to offer it to Western Europe to rebuild. He wanted to offer it to Eastern Europe. And why do you think that is? Does Kennan care about the Eastern Europeans very much? As individual people or on a human level at all? No. He is concerned with foreign power. He is a foreign policy analyst. He offers it because that puts Stalin in an impossible position. It's a checkmate on Stalin. Now Stalin has two choices. Does he accept the money or not? If Stalin accepts the money and U.S. money floods into Eastern Europe and finances the rebuilding, then obviously those economies, those populations will view the United States in a favorable light, maybe overthrow their Soviet dictators. If Stalin refuses to accept the money, then that just reveals how much Stalin actually controls Eastern Europe, and those people have no real say for themselves. So it puts Stalin in a lose-lose situation, which for Kennan and the Americans, they say, it's a win-win for us. Eventually, Stalin does not allow the East Europeans to accept the money, therefore reveals the Soviet Union to be basically a dictatorship that has conquered Eastern Europe and is running it for its own benefit. Stalin gives the excuse of saying that you don't want to accept their money because they're just trying to get you in debt, therefore to rule you economically. Which is a decent argument to make, but the United States did not rule Western Europe as a colony, even after they financed the rebuilding. It pushed them around politically, very definitely. But it was not the kind of ruler and ruled, usually. And there's much more kind of cooperation. And the Marshall Plan ends up being not just for the United States, brilliant piece of economic analysis, but also a brilliant piece of foreign policy analysis, because at this point the East Europeans understand very quickly that they have no real say in anything that their governments or their economies are doing. It is all directed by Moscow. Their leaders are puppets. Okay, and when you look at the map of who got this money, you can see a very clear dividing line between East and West. The only country in the Soviet sphere that accepted the money is Austria, because Austria has a rebellious type of Soviet-style leader who kind of tells Stalin, yeah, I'll do what you want, then he goes back to Austria and tries to separate Austria in a lot of ways away from Stalin's absolute control. But you can see that the money goes into what eventually becomes West Germany, France, Britain, Italy, and the Western European economies recover much faster. Even by the 1950s, they're starting to grow very fast, and so there's a lot of prosperity in Western Europe. And Eastern Europe just absolutely stagnates right into the 1980s. And if you look at an economic or a income map of Germany, even today, reunified Germany, you can see basically where the split in the Cold War was. East Germany today is still trying to recover, and West Germany is booming. Even today, Western Germany has one of the fastest growing economies in the world, even right now in this worldwide depression we're in. Okay. Also in the late 40s, around 1949 or so, the United States, Britain, and France start moving toward bringing their occupation zones together into a unified West Germany. One of the major problems is that Berlin is also divided between an East and West. And you can see Berlin is surrounded by East Germany, the Soviet zone. So the problem of West Berlin is that you have this little island of capitalism surrounded by Soviet dictatorship and communism. And you have a growing West Berlin economy, just like West Germany, just like West Europe in general. So Berlin becomes like a microcosm of Europe and becomes really the flashpoint for hostilities in all of Europe. The Soviets desperately want to take control of West Berlin and will try over and over again for many, many years. But they never can. And one of the major problems is that you have all these eventually East Germans living in the Soviet zone that don't like living there because of the economic stagnation. They try to get to the West. And the easiest way to do so is to go to West Berlin, just walk into the city, get a passport, and take a train or a plane or something, and go to Western Europe. And a lot of Eastern Germans and a lot of Eastern Europeans in general were doing that. And it was generally the people who could afford to. People who had some amount of money to buy the tickets and actually pick up and go. So you're getting teachers, engineers, scientists, writers, artists, intellectuals flooding out of Eastern Europe as fast as they can possibly go throughout the 50s. And that's very embarrassing for the Soviets because it's what historians call voting with your feet. If you don't like where you live, then you get up and move. Simple as that. And if you watch the population migrations, you can tell where people want to live just by watching where they go, and you can tell where they don't want to live based on where they're going, where they're coming from. Does that make sense? And you generally tend to get that happening wherever you get a wealthy and prosperous place located to a very poverty-ridden place. And you can see that in different parts of the world, especially right here around Los Angeles, right? Because there's another country that has problems, put it that way, close by, and a lot of people come to the Los Angeles area in order to escape. But this was so humiliating and economically damaging of Eastern Europe and East Germany in particular that the Soviets eventually will build a wall around Western Germany. Not to keep their own people, or to keep the enemy out, which is usually why you build a wall, right? I build a wall here to keep those monsters in the parking lot out from getting me, or vampires, or zombies, or whatever. That's why people usually build walls, to keep the enemy out. The Soviets eventually build a wall and turn their guns in to keep their own population basically imprisoned. Okay, and that whole movement kicks off what has come to be known as the expansion of the Cold War. And this is what Europe generally looks like by about 1948-49, very rigidly divided between East and West. And it's increasingly dangerous. Okay. One of the major escalators of the Cold War is when the Soviets got the atomic bomb in August of '49. The Americans, scientists generally believed that the Soviets wouldn't get the bomb for at least 10 years. And some of the estimates go as far as 20 or 30 years. They basically believed that the Soviet Union and their scientists were so backward and so far behind that they wouldn't be able to catch up to American scientific developments for a long time. So the American population, the American government is very much shocked and very, very worried when the Soviets get the bomb so quickly, because it was unplanned for. There are accusations of Soviet spies in the United States, because how else could they get the bomb quickly unless they stole it, and they stole the plans and whatnot, which is true on the lower levels. That also kicks off an internal debate amongst the Truman administration to build the bigger bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which has a lot of different names: the super bomb, thermonuclear bomb, the fusion bomb. This bomb was estimated, it was not built yet by the Americans or anybody else, but the scientists who built the original atomic weapons theorized that something larger could be built. They didn't want to build it though. The scientists were very worried and very upset by what they had done with the original atomic bombs. They were horrified, most of them. So they theorized that a bigger bomb could be built, but they didn't want to build it, and they advised the American government to not build it. But when the Soviets get their own atomic bomb, the Truman administration basically makes a decision that Stalin knows that this bigger bomb can be built, so he will build it, and he will do anything necessary to build it, because Stalin is a military dominance-oriented type of person. So the American government eventually makes a decision to build the hydrogen bomb in order to at least keep up with the Soviet developments. Does that make sense? And this thing is scary beyond belief. Anyone ready for the map? Okay, I'll show you why. Okay, here's the Hiroshima bomb. Trinity is the first test in New Mexico. So these are 15 kilotons, 20 at absolute most. When you take the size of the Hiroshima and Trinity bombs, they are compared to the hydrogen bombs by, say, these two measurements are these two down here. See that? These are the first hydrogen bomb explosions. These are 1,000 times more powerful. 1,000 times. So this stuff gets scary real fast. And you saw what one bomb over Hiroshima had done. Just leveled the city. The fusion bomb does much more. And when the Americans and the Soviets start mass producing these fusion bombs, very quickly, within about a decade, each side will have the predicted capacity to completely wipe out the other country, entire population, within about half an hour. And that's where we largely stand today, except today it's extended to elimination of all life on the planet in about 20 minutes. And these bombs still exist, and they remain on a 5-minute warning to fire. So to put this into terms that some of you may understand, if you guys know what a kilobyte is in computer terms, imagine the size of 15 kilobytes compared to 15 megabytes. Or 15 megabytes compared to 15 gigabytes. Yeah. There you go. So, questions about this? And these can still go off at any minute. And there have been false alarms, hundreds of them, over the past 50 years, 60 years or so. Probably the scariest one was the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that's the one that most people know about. There's been hundreds of other smaller, close calls. So, sleep tight. Okay. Another high-level document is created right after, just months after the decision to build the hydrogen bomb. And this is called NSC 68, National Security Council Paper number 68. It's a secret document that is created within the highest levels of the State Department. The big writer of the thing is named Kennan, George Kennan. He's on the left. He also came up with the Marshall Plan. Approved by the Secretary of State in the middle and the President on the right. The major idea within NSC 68 is called the Doctrine of Containment. This is the theory of how the United States will fight the Cold War. The theory is Soviet-style communism has spread from Russia and now into Eastern Europe. How are we going to combat this? It is impossible militarily once the Soviets get atomic weapons. You do not want to start World War III against them, because then they can start annihilating your cities also. So World War III is to be avoided. So how are you going to beat the Soviets in the Cold War? The theory is, do not let Soviet communism spread anymore. Don't let communism at all spread anymore. If they try to spread it to another country, the United States should use what Kennan called counterforce. Basically Truman Doctrine, U.S. money, U.S. weapons, eventually even U.S. troops, to stop the spread of communism into what Kennan called valuable areas. And we could talk more about what he thought were valuable if you want. But the theory is, don't let communism spread anymore, because communism is so internally hypocritical that given a few years, the people living under communism will hate it so much because of the poverty and the dictatorship aspects of it that Stalin had created, that eventually they will rebel internally and take down the Soviet Union themselves. So you don't have to invade the Soviet Union. They will destroy it. It will collapse from within given enough time. And Kennan estimated this would hopefully take maybe about 10 years. So that's why he calls it containment. You don't let it spread anymore and let them destroy each other, basically. The problem, though, is that the Soviet threat to the world, Kennan said, is imminent, which means they are looking for areas to expand communism into, and it's militarized. They are going to use the military to do it if they possibly can. So the United States has to ramp up defense spending, war spending, just in case, and especially atomic money spending, because they want to have enough atomic weapons to be able to fight World War III if it came to it. Also, there's an advocacy for the creation of an international spy agency to basically be the eyes and ears of the United States out in the world, to listen closely for attempts at communist infiltration into different places. So the CIA is created and given large budgets, and is declared that it can only operate outside the United States. It's not allowed to have secret missions and whatnot domestically. So containment is basically the U.S. foreign policy that will fight and eventually win the Cold War with great cost. Kennan's estimation of 10 years obviously didn't happen. This thing went on and on and on for almost another 40 years. But that's something that he was eventually pretty disappointed about. But for the rest of the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans will avoid a direct military conflict between each other because it's dangerous. And by the 1970s, they can end basically all life on the planet. So they will fight what we call proxy wars. They'll hire other people to fight for them. So you get these smaller wars in places like Vietnam or Cuba or all these other places in the world where the Soviets and the Americans will basically send money and weapons to other peoples to fight against each other, and they basically become like the pawns in the Cold War. Pawns, they'll eventually kill millions and millions of people. So, good with this one? So, containment is a very big and important idea to remember. And the Korean War that broke out just, 2 months after, seemed to prove the accuracy of NSC 68. The Korean Peninsula was not very well defended by the Americans, and it appears that Stalin and the North Korean communist areas knew it, so they launched an attack against the South in June of 1950. And this is just a few months after NSC 68. So the writers and the implementers at the highest levels of NSC 68 in the American government see Korea as evidence for what they had just theorized. And of course, the United States starts not just sending money and weapons to South Korea to defend itself, but eventually U.S. troops land under UN permission to push the communists back into the north. And eventually they try to reconquer even North Korea, but that didn't work when China intervened. Yeah?
Were North Korea and South Korea separate countries then? Or?
Yes. In World War II, Japan is really just kind of off in this area down here, right? Japan had conquered North Korea long ago and had ruled it as a colony even through World War II. So when Japan was knocked out of World War II, this area became independent. There's a threat of civil war between communists largely located in the north and others in the south. So they went through and divided the peninsula at the 38th parallel and said we'll have eventually elections. But the invasion happened before the elections. So there's a ceasefire that gets signed that restabilizes a border at the 38th parallel in 1953, which is where the division still is today. And it's still a ceasefire today. They're still technically at war. And the United States has guaranteed the South's survival by putting about 30,000 U.S. troops in South Korea, and they've been there ever since. Not the same guys, but... The North Korean army is much larger, but the American army isn't really there to defend the place so much. They're there to get killed in case of an invasion. It's what American foreign policy people call a tripwire. You send a bunch of American children there, American soldiers, so if the North invades, a bunch of those American soldiers will get killed, right? And that brings the U.S. immediately into the war because of U.S. popular outrage. The U.S. has done that in many different places, so it's not much a surprise. So, questions about Korea at all? Moving on. All right, so by mid to late 1950, the two sides have basically hardened into mutually antagonistic camps, and they are spreading their message to the rest of the world, join us, and they look to defend what they have held. This leads to several real problems, especially for U.S. foreign policy. Korea was one example. China was probably the biggest example. China also underwent another civil war after World War II, communists versus basically a grouping of others. And the communists eventually won that war when the Americans stopped supporting the anti-communist group. And when China so-called fell to communism in 1949, that also caused a lot of panic and fear in American society and amongst the American government about, what does this mean? There's a lot of assumptions that the Chinese communists would eventually sign a deal to be a kind of member of the Soviet sphere of influence in the world, that they're going to ally themselves with the Soviet Union. Eventually didn't really happen, but that's the American fear. And based off that fear, there's an American assumption throughout the world that any new nationalist movement emerging from a formerly colonized place like Southeast Asia or India or Latin America or Africa, when you get these post-colonial elections, that these new governments will often get communists elected. And why do you think that is? Why do Marxist politicians have a lot of favorable hearings in these new nations?
They support the poor people there?
Exactly. The people of Central or South Africa or South or Southeast Asia, their experience with capitalism was not very fun. They were colonized. They were oppressed for hundreds of years, going all the way back to when we started this semester with Columbus and going around the south of Africa and all that. That's hundreds of years of oppression by Europeans. And those indigenous peoples now get to vote for who they want to run their new countries. And they often vote for socialists or outright communists because those politicians say, we're going to build public housing, we're going to build public hospitals, we're going to build public education, we're going to support the poor. And the American government looks at the rise of these new politicians and says, well, they're communists. Therefore, they don't just want to build that stuff in their own country, they want to form alliances with the Soviet Union, which makes them American enemies. Does that make sense? So this big term, post-colonial nationalist movement, literally means when the European empires break down after World War II, you get nationalists in Korea, in Vietnam, in India, in Pakistan, in South Africa, Cuba, all these other places in the world. And the American assumption is when communists get elected and they start to govern, that they are not just governing internally, they're signing international alliances with the Soviets, which in a lot of instances just never happened. But that's the American assumption. So they will look to attack and try to destroy communism in a lot of these so-called third world places. Oops. Because Karl Marx, his message was anti-capitalism. And their experience with capitalism was not very fun. And was in fact very bloody in a lot of instances. So as both the Soviets and the Americans seek allies throughout the third world, both sides offer the idea of freedom and liberty, and both sides also, when they get an opportunity, often go in to dominate those third world countries. So it's not just the Soviets doing this, and there's a long history of the Americans doing this, setting up two big dictatorships in third world countries, just because those dictators promised to keep the communists out. And there's a lot of instances of that throughout the world. And that's an assumption that will go on throughout the 1980s even, right through the end of the Cold War. And the U.S. government will use that as an excuse to basically conquer and oftentimes oppress indigenous peoples throughout the world. This was useful in the Cold War, especially to the Americans and the Soviets, because, in places like Cuba, you can hire Cubans to kill each other. And in that way, the Soviets and the Americans fought against each other by supplying the Cubans with weapons in their own civil wars and whatnot, or the Hondurans, or the Guatemalans, or the Iranians, or Indians, or whoever, Vietnamese, Cambodians. It's just, the list goes on and on and on and on. And the U.S. will often, when they think communists are taking over certain places, just destabilize and topple those governments and set up dictatorships. And so they do the same thing. And this is the kind of stuff that governments often do when they believe that they are automatically on the side of right, the side of justice, and the side of liberty, and all that kind of stuff. And especially when their populations believe it. So these are big, important ideas to understand about the long-term Cold War, not just, say, Korea or Cuba or anything like that. This happens over and over and over and over again for many, many years. So questions about these ideas at all? Okay, moving on. All right. Okay, this is a chart, not completely accurate, but a generalization of the amount of nuclear weapons that each side eventually will hold and the kind of long-term buildup. So you see around 1950 or so, each country, has very few atomic weapons. The United States maybe had 50 or 100 by about 1950, and then they start really building up quickly. The Soviets take a while to catch up, not just technologically, but mass production-wise. So the Americans have their giant buildup, usually in the 60s, up until about the mid-60s. And by that point, they get 15,000 or so they're good. And then the Soviets largely start to build up. Does anyone know why you get this giant dip in nuclear armament in the late 60s for the U.S.?
Protests?
Well, not just protests and treaties, but the U.S. military was spending money on other things at that point. Vietnam. So you get a dip. And you get a general kind of, if not stability, but long-term also going down, especially in the 80s when they start signing treaties with each other. You see they both start going down pretty quickly. So the Soviets largely caught up to the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. So you have what we call parity, equality, between the amount of destruction each side can render against the other. And it's absolute. By the late 1950s, U.S. foreign policy now start calling this mutual assured destruction. If you start World War III, your society will be destroyed. There's no way to stop it. So the best theory is to not start World War III against the Soviets, because if you do, the United States will be gone the next day. And the same thing on the Soviet side. They also came to believe that you shouldn't start this war against the Americans because even if you destroy the United States, there's no way you're going to survive to see it. That's what we call nuclear deterrence. Basically, if your enemy has big, scary weapons, you don't attack. Because there's no way you live. That's it.
Being crazy over here.
Okay, now going back to economics, the United States invested in what became known as the European economic miracle. So the U.S. grows economically just in massive proportion in the 1950s, one of the biggest booms in human history. And the Europeans followed up on that. They caught the tail end of it. So Western Europe is largely rebuilt throughout the 50s and becomes a powerful economic engine and prosperous area for itself. Eastern Europe, not nearly so much. So you may see that term in textbooks and whatnot. The Soviet economy did not grow quickly because it's a controlled economy. And this is, when you look at a lot of the ideologies that are still in political parties and statements from candidates today, some of them are very true. The Soviet system was not a system for economic growth because all the factories and all the industry and all the technology are owned and operated by government. And government tends to hire people and keep them on the payroll for a long time with the same salary. And this is the idea of number 3. When you get everyone in the economy working for the government at the same salary, it doesn't matter how much you work. Right? If you're going to make the same $40,000 a year this year, if you really work hard and you, develop a lot of really good technology and a lot of more innovative and efficient systems, and the next year you're going to get paid the same amount of money, why bother? Why not just clock in and sit at your desk and maybe fall asleep for about a year, and next year you're going to make the same amount of money anyway, so, why work so hard? There's not the incentive of more money for good or efficient performance. So the Soviet communist economy stagnates quickly and does not reemerge in a growth kind of mindset for a long time. And that's one of the major and one of the best criticisms of communism. Without the motivation of wealth to work harder and do better, a lot of people won't. Just like when I was working retail and my boss asked me, how come you're not working very hard today? I said, I get paid minimum wage. And I get paid on an hourly basis. And I get paid the same amount per hour no matter how much work I do. And I said to her, minimum wage demands minimum work. That's the natural result. And she said, okay. She was a funny lady. I think she understood I was making a joke, but...
You didn't get fired.
Yep, and just like the brilliant movie Office Space said, that kind of economic motivation only motivates me to work just hard enough to not get fired. And you're not going to get much more than that. The other major problems of Soviet-style communism was that Stalin's rule from the 1920s forward basically stayed in effect. Stalin was paranoid of military attacks, so with government running all the factories, the government leaders decided what was made in society. And they devote all of their factories virtually to making military weapons. So they're focused on steel production, coal production, how many tanks and bombs and planes and all that stuff can you make in 1 year. And they basically ignore making enough shoes, enough toothpaste for the population. And if you ever read the book 1984 about the poverty of the people living in that system, that criticism was very widely felt and understood in the West also. But if the Soviet economy is stagnating so quickly and doing so badly internally and even angering its own people, why did the Westerners fear it? And they did fear it the whole time, the whole Cold War. Because the government can do whatever it wants. The government can dedicate as much as it wants to military, as much as it wants to atomic spending, because there's no public oversight. There are no elections in the Soviet Union that the people have any access to. So it's not like Congress in the United States today can basically decide to spend all government revenue on making bombs. Because the congressmen who vote for that would probably get voted out of office because they piss off their people, right? So your voting power is important. And the Soviet populations and the Eastern European populations didn't have that vote. Therefore, they couldn't kick their leaders out of office. Therefore, the leaders could vote to do whatever they wanted with the industrial system they had. So the Soviets always have a bigger army than even the United States throughout the whole Cold War. They have more soldiers, they have more tanks, they have more planes, they have more bombs. And that's it. And it's estimated throughout the whole Cold War, if the Soviets actually tried to attack Western Europe, they'd probably overrun the place very quickly militarily. Okay, so questions about any of these? No. All right, so the economic problems and the stagnation in the East was very well known by especially the mid-50s. West Germany was unified, the West European areas were rebuilding and becoming prosperous, and the East was stagnant. And that's what really encourages people to leave the East and try to go to the West, which in turn encouraged the Soviets to build the wall around West Berlin. And the wall literally goes up in the middle of the night in early August of '61. At first it was a kind of impromptu fence guarded by Soviet army guards. So if you tried to climb the fence, you were shot. And eventually they built it into a large kind of wall complex. But the Berlin Wall comes to symbolize the Cold War, not just the division of Berlin and the division of Europe, division of Germany, but also the social and economic and cultural differences, where you have one side basically frozen in time and not growing, the other side very dynamic, open to change, at least more open to change than the eastern side. And that's the power of people voting with their feet until they're not allowed to do that anymore. And you get all kinds of Bugs Bunny-esque plans to get over the wall or through the wall or under the wall. There you get people digging tunnels, and one Soviet soldier or East German soldier hijacked a tank and drove through the wall and got out and ran to the other side as fast as he could. But people are literally killed trying to get through this thing. And any Soviet or East German soldier who looks the other way when his friends are running across, if he's caught, that soldier is killed. So this is a rigid, harsh, cutthroat dictatorship. And again, they build the wall and they point their guns internally at their own people. Okay, so the ideological hypocrisy, to do this as fast as possible, is that Stalin, like Lenin, like Marx, was convinced that communism is perfect. It is infallible. It has the answer for all human society by eliminating inequality, eliminating the differences between rich and poor. So they claimed that communism was the future of human freedom, and that people would choose it if they were allowed. But the problem by the 1950s was nobody was really choosing it unless you put a gun in their face. And that was very apparent throughout the world. The places that Soviet-style communism spread to was not by voting, wasn't by popular choice, but by the invasion of the Red Army, or the occupation of the Red Army. And that was a stark difference that the Europeans understood very deeply. In other places of the world, you will get communists that get elected into government, at least socialists. But the difference is a lot of them don't sign alliances with the Soviet Union because they don't want the Soviets in their area for the most part. There are some exceptions to that, but a lot of communist movements will take money and weapons from the Soviet Union, but if they become independent and they have their own country, they often try to distance themselves from the Soviet leadership as much as possible. They wanted to run their own countries independently. Stalin died in March of '53, so you're going to get a leadership struggle that isn't really resolved for a few years as the new group tries to consolidate power and knock out their enemies and whatnot. So it's not really resolved until about the end of '55, going into '56. And this is where the new guy named Khrushchev rises up. And he announces his kind of new premiership, his leadership, in February of '56, a meeting of the communists in the Soviet Union. Gives a major speech in February of '56 which said three really important things for the Cold War. Number one, defines Stalin as basically an international criminal for all the murder and disappearances and political violence he inflicted on the Russian people and the Eastern Europeans. So that was a shocking thing for a Soviet leader to say, to quickly define Stalin as basically a mass murderer. Another thing that was shocking was Marxism, within its ideology, had the idea that no communist society could ever avoid a war with a capitalist society. They would attack each other because their views are so opposite of each other. And that becomes dangerous in the Cold War because of the nuclear weapons. If war is inevitable, the Soviets and the Americans both have thousands of nuclear weapons, then the end of humanity is inevitable, right? World War III is inevitable, therefore nuclear war and all the destruction will happen at some point. Therefore, Khrushchev says, war cannot be inevitable anymore. We have to learn to live with the Americans, to live with the capitalists, because risking World War III is just guaranteed destruction. Nobody really wants that. And number 3, and for the short term most important, he says that the Soviet Union will not have to so rigidly control its satellites anymore, especially its East European governments. And that's important because that sends an international message. And the East Europeans listen pretty closely. So movements start in the fall of '56 to really kick out a lot of Stalin's appointees and bring in a new generation of leaders in places like Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. And at that point, Khrushchev had a choice to make. Do you actually allow them to do this and have some kind of independence? Or do you reassert dominance? And does anyone know what he chose? Reassert dominance. So when the Hungarians tried to get rid of Stalin's appointees and start to be much more independent, they still said they were going to be communists, but Khrushchev didn't want to take that risk, so he sent in the Soviet army, invaded Hungary, flattened major parts of the capital city, killed somewhere around 30,000 Hungarians, and put his people back in control. So the so-called Hungarian Revolt of '56 reveals the mass internal hypocrisy of Soviet statements. They will tell their friends and their allies throughout the world that they are free to make their own decisions, but when those allies try to make their own decisions, here comes the Soviet army to take control again. And that happens over and over again throughout the world. So the hypocrisy on the Soviet side is very clear. To an overwhelming amount of people throughout the world. The American hypocrisy is also just as clear to a lot of people in the world, where the Americans promise to support peace and freedom and liberty, and when people, when votes are taken and socialists get elected, here comes the American government to topple and control. No questions about that at all? No. Moving on? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of the important things to understand about the political 1950s in the United States is that there was gross inequality and racism and all kinds of problems in the U.S., but a lot of those are solved democratically through elections, through popular movements. And the biggest symbolic one, of course, is segregation, which was ended legally by the Supreme Court and then took a mass popular movement to actually enforce and convince the executive branch to enforce. So this is where you get people like Martin Luther King, eventually a constitutional amendment to guarantee voting rights, which former slaves, freed slaves from 1865, were allowed to vote starting in 1868, 69, when they passed the 15th Amendment, but they just haven't been allowed to vote for 100 years because of racism. So this amendment, supported democratically on the state level, guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. And then they expanded it in 1920 to women, and then in 1967, 68 to anyone 18 or over. Does anyone know why you get to vote when you're 18? Because you're eligible for the draft. So the theory is, if the government can take you out of your home and send you to some other part of the world to fight, then you should have a say in who's making those decisions, right? Yeah. Question?
Didn't they used to, voting was 21 and over until the 60s or 70s, right?
It depended on states.
Oh.
Yeah, a lot of individuals.
I think I remember when that changed.
Yeah, I think it went through in 69 or 70. It was a direct result of the Vietnam War, where a lot of these guys were being drafted at age 18, and they couldn't vote for who was the president. I mean, that's a tough thing to deal with, and it's pretty unjust on a whole lot of levels. But the message of this one is, U.S. internal problems could be overcome through democratic movements, which is not possible in the Soviet Union at all, and wouldn't be for the rest of the Soviet Union's existence. And in the late 60s, the Soviets did it again. When the Czechoslovakian people started to basically have a kind of freedom movement in Prague, their major city, throughout the spring, summer of 1968. Soviets went in again with the tanks. And by this time, Khrushchev had been knocked out and replaced with another guy named Brezhnev. And Brezhnev gave a statement justifying this invasion of Czechoslovakia. It became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. The basic statement is the Soviet Union has the right to intervene in any of its satellites where socialism in general is threatened. But he said socialism, but we would recognize it as communism. He said that the Soviet Union is the leader of the communist movement. Therefore, wherever communism is threatened within its sphere, its area, they have the right to go in with the tanks to guard the equalities of the people. Which is a strange thing. How do you guard equality? By sending in the army to repress. But the hypocrisy of that statement was very well known internationally right from the moment he said it. But that's the ruling ideology of the Soviet Union, foreign policy-wise. When they start to get out of line, send in the army. And they'll kill tens of thousands of people to retain control. So the Brezhnev Doctrine is an important idea also in the Cold War. And again, points out a major hypocrisy. Of course, the United States was doing largely similar things throughout the world, toppling foreign governments that they didn't like and sometimes killing thousands of people in doing so. But again, internally within the United States, you have freedom movements and whatnot going on. And a lot of them are not killed. Some of them are. But again, you have a much greater access to freedom and individualism and decision-making and democratic movements in the West than in the East. And the trick for the United States in the Cold War was to say, our side is better, which is always a political trick. They give you two options and say, well, our side isn't as bad as that side, right? You see that in politics all the time. Vote for me because that person's nuts. And it's a false dilemma because there's almost always more than two choices, right? You didn't have to live in the United States or Soviet Union. Go somewhere else. A lot of other countries in the world. And hopefully you don't end up in one that is conquered eventually. And again, probably the politician who came closest to dictatorship in the whole Cold War is probably Nixon. Used the CIA, the IRS, the FBI, all kinds of bodies to destroy his political enemies, which was grossly illegal. So he was also taken out by a democratic movement. His own party even voted to impeach and remove him from office eventually. He resigned before they could fulfill the process. But he was impeached, and he just didn't go to trial because he resigned the office before the trial started. Okay, going into the 1980s, try to end this real quick. Brezhnev died in like 84, 82 or something like that, followed by a series of other really old guys because they're all Stalin's former kind of helpers, his lieutenants. So these guys are all in their 80s and 90s by the time the early 80s come around. So you get a real quick bunch of them that go into the premiership and then they die like a few months later. So Gorbachev, when he is eventually in a kind of very close election at the highest levels of the Soviet government, elected Soviet premier in 85, he is seen as the young guy, which is probably strange for you to look at him and think he's a younger generation. But this was very true of Gorbachev. He was seen as a reformer, and he immediately starts moving to change the Soviet system in small ways. He proposed two major systems that are basically two sides of the same coin. Perestroika is basically the admittance that the Soviet economy is stagnant. And the idea is he wants to take free market money motivations and put them in place in very strategic small places of the Soviet economy to promote growth and innovation. One of the problems with that is people won't innovate because they're afraid of being attacked by the government. Because in order to innovate, you have to do what first? Recognize a problem and complain about it. You weren't allowed to complain in the Soviet system or else you disappeared. So his second policy, Glasnost, is to open the Soviet kind of complaint system to allow citizens to actually talk about mistakes their government had made. which they hadn't been allowed to do for 70 years almost by this point. So these are, in the West we would see these as very small-scale changes, but in those societies they're seen as revolutionary. And when they start to get the ability to complain, things start flying out of control. And the East Europeans start complaining, and they start mass movements in the late 80s. And in 1989, they start gathering in their capital cities. And when Gorbachev announces that he will not send the Red Army in to repress these movements, those movements overthrow their own governments within a matter of weeks. So the Brezhnev doctrine, the idea of the Red Army establishing control by slaughtering people, when that idea is taken out of the equation, the Eastern European governments fall almost immediately. So basically, when you take out Stalinism from these areas, the Stalinist governments collapsed just through popular pressure. And the Berlin Wall was taken down in literally a night. And you can tell the anger and the frustration these people had felt for decades, because they went out in the middle of the night and literally tore the thing down with their hands. And this was a popular thing to do, to go get your shovels and your sledgehammers and go take the wall down. And the Soviet Empire collapses, which was an unthinkable thing at that point. Most Americans and Westerners believed that the Cold War would go on for decades and decades and decades. Even books written in 86, 88 predicted that the Cold War would go on for another 40 or 50 years. And it was unthinkable that it would end without a World War III. So the internal collapse was predicted by Kennan in 1949, 1950, but had really been forgotten in a lot of ways. And when it happened, it was shocking to especially the U.S. leadership. They didn't know what to do. They had to figure out what to do. Eventually, even when the Soviet Union voted itself, its Soviet leaders, on Christmas Day of '91 to end the Soviet Union's existence. They voted for political suicide, basically. And again, surprised the U.S., they didn't know what to do. It was Christmas Day, and they convened an emergency session to figure out what the new U.S. foreign policy was. And it's pretty murky for a few years, because they're caught so off guard. So there's a step-by-step of it. The former Stalinist dictators of Eastern Europe, a lot of them are arrested, a lot of them sent out of the country. Romania, the Romanians went and caught their dictator, took him out into the parking lot of the government building and machine gunned him and his wife to death on camera. So there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration, a lot of fear that these guys might get back into office and launch the repression. So some of them were just executed to end that threat. Not very judicious, or judicial, put it that way, but that's how it ended.